It was a typical neighborhood party where people gathered in pre-organized groups. One group talked about football, another did gardening, soccer moms sat in the living room, and DIY enthusiasts sat in the dining room. Since I work shifts, I arrived a little after midnight and had a lot to catch up on. Luckily, I lived next door, so I didn't have to worry about drinking and driving. I was making myself a drink in the kitchen when Lee came in to get more ice. Lee was the owner, and I had a warm relationship with her from the day she and her husband Brad moved here. She knew I was interested, but we both knew it was never meant to be, and our relationship became a good-natured, semi-sexual, mutually beneficial relationship. Lee was 3 months pregnant and had that healthy, sexy glow that women have, and to me she had never looked sexier. I can't get over this, baby. 3 months pregnant and still the sexiest woman in town. You look good enough to eat. Lee beamed at me. Thank you, kind sir. All compliments are gratefully received. The doorbell knocked me out of a restless sleep. I glanced at my bedside clock and wondered who could get me out of bed at 9 a.m. on a Sunday. I grabbed my robe and walked to the door. I looked out the peephole and saw Lee standing there. I opened the door, invited her in, and only then noticed how strangely she was dressed, high heels and a raincoat. But when I looked outside, I saw nothing but bright sunlight. Lee turned to me and said, "Did you really mean it last night when you said that, despite being pregnant, I was the sexiest woman in town?" I stared at her in some confusion. Why is she asking me such a question? Coming to my senses, I said, "Absolutely. All you have to do is give me a chance and I will prove it." Now, any other time I would have said something like that, she would have just laughed and called me a big flirt, but this time she surprised the hell out of me. She opened her cloak, let it fall to the floor, and stood naked before me. "Could you prove it by having sex with me?" Dear God, I wish I could someday. I picked her up and carried her to my bedroom, where we spent the next 3 hours doing everything we could to please each other. She was a tigress in bed, and every time I felt like I had given it all I had, she managed to get me back on my feet. We only stopped when it was time for Brad to return home from golfing. The story Lee told me was that as soon as they found out she was pregnant, Brad stopped having sex with her, even though the doctor told them everything would be fine for the rest of the pregnancy. Brad did not touch her for fear of harming the child. Brad was ready to caress her private part to try to give her some satisfaction, but that was all. She was used to having sex every day, and ever since Brad left her, she had been climbing the walls, but no matter how much she begged and begged, he would not have sex with her. The next morning, Lee showed up at my front door just as Brad was getting ready for work. We headed straight to my bedroom. Over the next few months, Lee and I made love every chance we got. Monday through Friday, she was at my house as soon as Brad left for work. On Saturdays, she would call me if she needed to leave the house to go somewhere, and I would meet her. On Sunday, Brad played golf while Lee and I worked on our own holes. However, eventually, Lee went too far and we had to stop. She was finally giving birth to a little girl, and I began counting the days until the doctor cleared her to resume sex. But I was sorely disappointed. A few weeks after the baby was born, Lee came to my house for coffee. She thanked me for being her friend and for being there for her in her time of need. She told me that if I ever needed anything to just let her know. I told her that what I needed most was for her to get permission from her doctor so we could resume our sex life. Lee looked at me strangely and said, "We can't start over. Once the doctor says everything is okay, Brad will take care of my needs." And so it was. Soon she and Brad returned to their daily routine, and I was left with a longing that could not be quenched. I stopped going to neighborhood parties where I might see her, and generally did everything I could to avoid her. One morning she knocked on my door and invited me to have coffee with her. She directly asked me why I was acting like a stranger. I chuckled and denied it before he couldn't stand it and told her the truth. I just couldn't stand being around her after what we had together, knowing it would never happen again. "I thought we were friends," she said. "No, Lee, we were much, much more than friends. And that's something I can't forget." The next 6 months flew by. I had several girlfriends, but none of them could hold my attention for long. Sometimes I saw Lee in her backyard and felt an unbearable sadness. And then one morning the doorbell rang. I opened the door and saw Lee standing there. I moved aside to let her in, and as I turned to close the door, I was just in time to see her dress fall to the floor. Naked, wearing only high heels, she smiled at me. "Guess what, lover? I'm pregnant." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.